And one of the things that's funny, I mean, mundane astrology, just taking this back historically, was the original form of astrology in Mesopotamia. And then eventually they developed natal astrology in the 5th century BC or so. And it's interesting that Ptolemy is really, as you said, one of our only Hellenistic sources for mundane astrology. Like, you don't see a lot of other mundane astrology outside of Ptolemy, largely, at least it seems like from our vantage point, because most of the texts in the Greek or the Hellenistic tradition were dedicated towards natal astrology. So it's interesting that Ptolemy becomes one of the only sources for that, and that stream of influence then sort of influences the later medieval tradition after the 7th and 8th centuries. But then you get this other stream that you're talking about that's coming in from Persia and from India that has things like the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions and other things that don't show up in the earlier Hellenistic tradition.
Yeah, it came full circle, but by the time it came back to mundane, in that same region of the world, they were using Hellenistic astrology and were no longer really doing omen astrology anymore.
Right. That's really fascinating. And I mean, one of the things it kind of brings up is something I've heard talked about a few times, which is the question of just like how much material from the earlier Mesopotamian tradition, if any at all, did the Persians preserve from basically the earlier Mesopotamian tradition from prior to Hellenistic astrology? Did any of that material survive and then sort of almost circumvented the Hellenistic tradition so that it shows back up in the medieval tradition as this kind of like new thing that we hadn't otherwise seen previously? I know there's some astrologers that kind of argue sort of for that the Persians may have preserved more than we think or more than we know. And then there's others that seem to think that it was more like they invented or developed things in the Sasanian period that were later introduced in the medieval period and become more prominent, but they were somewhat recent innovations.
Yeah, I think at least with the material that I've translated, I don't really see anything that seems like it could come from old omen astrology. But there are still a lot of earlier Persian and Indian writers in Arabic that have not been translated yet. That is on my list of things to do, but it could be that some of these guys that were writing in the 600s and the 700s, say before Masha Allah and before Umar al-Tabari, they might have preserved some of that material. But it doesn't seem to be in the mainstream of the new Arabic language astrology from the late 700s.
Sure, that makes sense. And I mean, that's kind of what I would assume as well, but I guess it's just this ties in more to this argument or the sort of debate over the origins of Hellenistic astrology and, you know, how much of Western astrology existed as a sort of system or how many of the techniques existed prior to the emergence of Hellenistic astrology in the 1st century BC versus how much was sort of developed or invented around that point. But
it seems like, I mean, one reason to think that maybe not a lot survived, if anything, I suppose, is because of the influence of Hellenistic astrology on the Sasanian court. You know, when it's well known that when the Emperor Justinian, closed the school of philosophy at Athens, a number of philosophers who were also astronomically trained fled to the Near East, including to the Sasanian court. And they stayed in the region too. And I suppose if there was still a flourishing astrological tradition in Persia, they wouldn't have had so great an influence on the Persians, or the Persians wouldn't have been so eager to have them there in the first place.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, the closing of the philosophical schools, all of the philosophers pack up their books and their libraries and travel and relocate in Persia briefly. Okay, so maybe bringing it back, let's talk about some of the, I think we've touched upon some of the specific techniques, but let's go a little bit more in depth into some of the specific techniques that are used in the type of astrology and mundane astrology from this period. I know one of the biggest ones, the ones that the one that gets the most coverage, I think perhaps because it was one of the most important, was the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions as one of the main long-term predictive methods. So let's talk a little bit about that and how it's calculated and what they did with those cycles.
Okay. What they did was they observed Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions, which occur about every 20 years. It's every 19.8 years. Now, there are a couple things we have to understand, and the first thing is that they were looking at something called a mean conjunction. This is something that we don't have anymore in modern astronomy, and I'll have to explain what that means, but it's very important. And so they were looking at something called a mean conjunction, and they were especially observing an unusual pattern that happens with Jupiter and Saturn because of how fast they move. And that has to do with something called triplicity shifts. So we could talk about the triplicity shifts in a moment, but let me just briefly say that Saturn and Jupiter, when they conjoin every 20 years, they conjoin in a backwards trine from where they were 20 years before, except that they creep forward about 2.5 degrees. So if they were conjoined, let's say, today at 0 Aries, then in 20 years they will conjoin again at about 2.5 degrees Sagittarius. So a backwards trine, but creeping forward a couple degrees. And then 20 years later, they would they would again conjoin in a backwards trine in Leo, but again creeping forward up to about 5 degrees Leo. So they do this a number of times, slowly creeping forward, and then after a certain number of conjunctions, they no longer are in the fiery signs, they will shift to the earthy signs. And when that shift happens, the Persians say that there are things like new dynasties will appear, or new religions or new prophets will appear, or there will be changes in world power, and so on. So that's the larger pattern they're looking at. They're looking at individual conjunctions and the 20-year periods they govern, but then they're also looking at series of conjunctions in the same triplicity and when it shifts.
And that takes place approximately, how often does one of the elemental or triplicity shifts take place?
Well, officially, the standard theory was every 240 years, that it would be 12 conjunctions per triplicity, so it would be every 240 years. It so happens that that was an idealized theory that is not astronomically possible. And really, depending on whether you're using a tropical zodiac or a sidereal zodiac, it might be anywhere from maybe 200 to 220 years, maybe 240 years.
Okay. 200 to 240. So every 200 to 240 years, there is a shift where the conjunctions move from occurring in one triplicity, like fire, to moving in another triplicity, like earth.
Yeah. In the tropical zodiac, the number of conjunctions will be 11 or 10. In the sidereal zodiac, it'll be 11 or 12.